Today, Attorney General William Barr gave us a few new scraps of information about what he's doing with the Mueller report since he got it almost 3 weeks ago. For instance, he said today that the Mueller report will be released next week. He said, hopefully. Yesterday, he said it would be released within a week. Now it's next week, hopefully. Attorney General William Barr also said that he personally has not overruled Robert Mueller when it comes to any redactions in the report, but he also seemed to suggest that he's not personally participating in that process. He repeatedly described the redactions team, and at one point said that he had had the redaction team's logistical arrangements described to him, implying that he doesn't actually know what's going on with the redaction team. He also suggested that in addition to special counsel's office working on those various redactions, there's a bunch of personnel and lawyers from the Justice Department who are working on those redactions on that redaction team. But we don't know who those Justice Department lawyers or officials are, nor do we know the grounds on which they are proceeding alongside Mueller's investigators. What William Barr would not pointedly discuss today was his own behavior in terms of what he's already done with Mueller's investigation. Specifically, he would not discuss his own personal proclamation that even though Mueller's investigation didn't exonerate the president for criminal obstruction of justice, he, William Barr, did. He decided that the president was exonerated. It was on this point that Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen sort of hammered him at today's hearing.
I'm going to give my reaction and comments, about the report after the report.
Well, it would have been, but you put your view of the report out there on this issue of obstruction of justice, right? Nobody asked you to do that.
I didn't put my view of the report.
Well, you put your assessment on, you made a conclusion on the question of obstruction of justice that was not contained in the Mueller report.
I'm not going to discuss my decision. I will lay it out after the report is out.
Mr. Attorney General, the thing is, you put this out there. I mean, the president went out and tweeted the next day that he was exonerated. That wasn't based on anything in the Mueller report with respect to obstruction of justice. That was based on your assessment. That was on March 24th. And now you won't elaborate at all as to how you reached that conclusion.
I will discuss that decision after the report is out.
Did Bob Mueller support your conclusion?
I don't know whether Bob Mueller supported my conclusion.
I don't know whether Bob Mueller supported my conclusion. Why would I even ask him? It was like his investigation and his evidence. I know, but I threw it out there anyway. You could tell that there was some frustration in the room with the Attorney General avoiding these questions. He did get asked them, though, and he did seep out information with each additional follow-up question, and every senator who pressed him. Joining us now is Senator Chris Van Hollen, Democrat of Maryland, who was particularly effective today in his questioning. Senator, thank you for being with us tonight. I know this is a big day.
It's great to be with you, Rachel. Thanks.
So I am giving the Attorney General a little bit of a hard time tonight, both because of his affect in terms of answering your questions, but also because I have been surprised overall over these past 3 weeks to feel like he's not necessarily following the special counsel regulations to the letter of the law. He seems to be portraying a sort of constantly evolving quasi-legal framework in which he describes his actions and explains what he's doing. I feel like every time he talks about the Mueller investigation or the report or releases anything new about it, we're learning new stuff about how it's being handled. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
Oh, I think that's very fair. Look, no one designated Attorney General Barr to essentially substitute his decision and his judgment on this question of obstruction of justice for that of Mueller and his team, who looked at this for many, many months. But somehow Barr designated himself. It's not in the law. It's not in the regulations. And, of course, that's exactly what Trump was wanting him to do, because Trump immediately went out and tweeted that he was exonerated. Well, we know he's not exonerated. In fact, Mueller very clearly said he did not make an ultimate decision about whether or not President Trump was criminally liable for obstruction of justice. And so today I was pressing Barr not on the contents of the Mueller report. I wanted to know how he, Barr, reached that decision in 48 hours when Mueller said that there were, quote, difficult issues of fact and law about the president's activity and intent on obstruction of justice. And I want to know, Attorney General Barr, did you agree that there were difficult issues? Did you struggle with these issues? and he refused to answer.
He refused to answer and refused to answer and refused to answer. In the end, I felt like what he was implying to you was that there is some sort of explanation for his decision to declare that the president is exonerated that we will find in the report, or that he will be willing to describe out loud to members of Congress once the report itself has been filed. Again, it was an evolving explanation that he gave over the course of the day. But was that the impression that you were left with, that ultimately he would explain?
Well, clearly his explanation is not going to be in the Mueller report itself.
Right.
This is Mueller's report, and that's what I kept saying. I'm not asking you to tell us today everything in the Mueller report. I wish you would. But I'm just asking you, Attorney General Barr, how you reached this conclusion to exonerate the president. And he just, as you say, stonewalled. Now, we have to go back to that memo he wrote. We call it the audition memo, when he was trying to, get the president to look at him as a candidate for attorney general, where he wrote that a president could not be found guilty of obstruction of justice if the president was not found guilty on the underlying crime, in this case, criminal collusion with the Russians. But as you know, most legal experts think that's a ridiculous theory. There are many other ways that the president could obstruct justice. And you need sometimes to know the president's intent. So I asked the attorney general, did you have to determine the president's intent to make your conclusion, your exoneration conclusion? And he wouldn't say. So, but we're not going to get that in the Mueller report. The only way we're going to get that, Rachel, is by bringing Attorney General Barr back before the Congress after we get the report.
And briefly, Senator, when we do get the report, he said hopefully sometime next week now is his new estimation. I imagine that it'll be full of multicolored redactions with more or less generic explanations as to what justifies those redactions. If the report is substantially redacted and it really affects your ability as a senator to understand the implications of what Mueller found, do you feel confident that the Democrats in the Senate, that the Senate more broadly, that Congress even more broadly than that, has the tools it needs to get the full unredacted report pried out of Barr's hands, despite his efforts to hold on to it?
I do think so, Rachel. I mean, we can go through legal process and ultimately subpoena it. We can call Bob Mueller. And as Barr suggested in his testimony before the House the other day, it's possible Mueller could provide the report. So, look, there are lots of potential avenues here. I tried to get some assurance today from Barr that at least as they went through the redaction process, he was going to kind of recuse himself from that process. He did say that the Mueller team, together with the Department of Justice lawyers, were the ones who were sort of making these redactions. But when I asked him if he could guarantee us that he would not overrule them on any of their decisions, he did not make that commitment. So I think all of us still worry that he is continuing to do the bidding of the president. Of course, that was reinforced by the fact that in the middle of this hearing on when we're going to get the Mueller report, he let loose with this conspiracy theory on, the spying allegation, and then he said, look, I'm not sure there's an adequate predicate for this. I'm not suggesting I have something, but hey, here's an idea I'm going to throw out there while admitting that he had no evidence to provide the committee for that allegation. So I think whatever shred of credibility Attorney Barr may have still had left about being an independent administrator of justice, he lost it today by both his responses on the Mueller report and then letting fly with the latest conspiracy theory.
Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, thank you for your time tonight, sir. And I know that hearings like this are a bear, but it was a pleasure to watch you get after him today, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Much more to get to tonight. I have to tell you, we have Congressman Eric Swalwell here for his first primetime interview since he has announced that he is running for president. This will be a different kind of interview than you have ever seen with him. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.